since 2008, I've been working mainly in Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, and I've been researching the transnational connections between these two countries. And these connections have a long history dating back to pre-colonial times, but the main form of circulation between these two countries today has its roots in the colonial period, where the French administration realized that they could use the manpower of the interior to develop the plantation economy of the southern half of what is today Côte d'Ivoire. And as you may know, Côte d'Ivoire is still the largest producer of cocoa on the global market, with about a third of the global production today, even despite going through a civil war. What is important to then understand, of course, is that this productive relationship between Burkina Faso and Côte d'Ivoire was challenged by a political rhetoric during the 1990s, where Burkinabe labor migrants were seen as scapegoats for the declining economy in Côte d'Ivoire and the sort of growing social tensions and problems in that country. So during the late 1990s, political tensions gradually turned into what became a civil war in 2002, where immigrants were seen as sort of the main target of violence by the regime. And up towards 1 million Burkinabe citizens were forced to leave Côte d'Ivoire, many of them, of course, returning to their country of origin in Burkina Faso. And this has been the case study that I've been following since 2008. So, returning to Burkina Faso under these circumstances, these migrants were somewhere in between forced displacement and labor migration return. They had, of course, left Burkina Faso voluntarily, but they were now forced to return against their will. And their situation in Burkina Faso was generally one that resembled more a refugee situation than a labor migrant situation. And one group which was particularly vulnerable in this context were young adults returning to the country of origin of their parents, but having never lived in Burkina Faso themselves. So their situation was similar to what we, at least in the Scandinavian context, call second-generation immigrants, children of immigrants who have grown up outside their parents' country of origin. And in Burkina Faso, this meant that these young adults had difficulties integrating into local communities. They were seen as arrogant, as show-offish, and as Ivorians, or people pretending to be Ivorian. So arriving, they were given the sort of the label diaspo, which was a derogatory term for someone who not really a true Burkinabe, but not really a true Ivorian either. What I found striking in this research, and something that I hope can sort of add to a more nuanced understanding of what migration and displacement is about, is how these young adults, the diaspo, were able to turn these difficult circumstances into an advantage. By reappropriating the idea of diaspo, they were generally able to rebrand themselves as more cosmopolitan, more in touch with global popular culture, thanks to their upbringing in the more developed Côte d'Ivoire. And the idea of diaspo eventually became seen as a positive brand in Burkina Faso. Here you can see a hairdresser with the sign Diaspo Coiffure, Diaspo hairdressers, using the idea of diaspo as an advertisement. So they were able to turn this negative stereotype into something positive, into a positive brand. And I think it shows that even forced migration can have positive effects on the situation of migrants, which is not usually acknowledged when we think about refugees. Central to the research I've been doing is to acknowledge the variations that are apparent when you start talking more in depth to migrants about their experiences. So this particular experience of young adults was very different from many of the narratives I've heard from the parent generation of returning migrants to Burkina Faso. Here is Kadi, for example, who returned with her children, leaving her husband behind in Côte d'Ivoire to look for work. And she was exposed to the suspicions and resentment of her neighbors because she was living as a single mother, which is sort of morally dubious in this socio-cultural context. So Kadi had to face a fairly particular situation in terms of integrating that had to do with her being a woman without a husband. And these gendered ideas of migration were very different for returning men. Not only that, even within families, I experienced quite significant variations in how this journey was experienced. This is Abdoulaye, Kadi's oldest son, and he was able to continue his studies in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. And during a visit home at his mother's place, we had a talk, and he was telling me how shocked he was at how thin his mother had become, and at her living situation in general, because he was living a fairly comfortable life as a student in the capital, while she was barely managing to secure one meal a day. So even within a family, there may be dramatic variations in how the effects of migration are experienced. And they may sometimes be fairly invisible even to other family members, let alone communities or actors involved in trying to assist migrants. I think that's important to acknowledge when we tend to think of migration as fairly categorically either voluntary or involuntary, for example. These variations in vulnerability are important to try to acknowledge and encompass in the way we perceive migration. Overall, I think that there's way too much emphasis on migration as a problem rather than seeing how migrants themselves are able to turn migration into a resource, even when it happens against their will initially. I think that my research in West Africa has shown that even involuntary returns can have positive effects, as it did on the Jesper youths, for example, and that migrants in general are capable of making the best even of dire circumstances. And I think the current policy trend of trying to address the root causes of migration emphasizes migration as a problem rather than seeing and acknowledging this positive side of migration. The idea of root causes actually comes from medical science, where we all know that you should treat the root causes of an illness or a disease rather than just the symptoms. But I don't see how that thinking translates into migration policy. That would mean that migration would be the illness and that we need to find the root causes in order to prevent further migration. But I think that in general, the issues that we want to try to prevent are, for example, the tragedy of migrants losing their lives on the Mediterranean Sea. And these tragedies are not the result of the incentive to migrate in and of itself, the migrant aspirations that we're now trying to discourage. They are the result of a system that regulates migration and creates very few opportunities for migrants who want to leave their countries and travel towards Europe. So focusing more on the facilitation of migration, I think, would address these root causes of tragedy much more efficiently. And that is true of migration even within the continent as well. There are debates now about encouraging free movement both at the AU level and in the West African Union, ECOWAS, which resembles the spirit of the European Union's encouragement of the free circulation of labor. And I think that perceiving migration fundamentally as a resource rather than a problem might create better policies and a better understanding of migrants' own experiences. Thank you.